Hey everyone, Leo here, and today I'm sitting down to do a book talk. So basically my idea about book talks is it's just me sitting down talking to you about a book that I've just read, and hopefully in the future also about like tropes that I like, and giving you examples of the books that I've read that have that trope and why I liked it in those books, etc. The idea behind the reason I wanted to do book talks is basically because I feel like my wrap-ups are so incredibly long, and I feel like for a book review, even though it's just the name that's different than a book talk, I guess, but for a review I feel like I need to have sort of an in-depth research into the book, be able to talk about all facets for it. Basically, the book talk is just like the long explanation about my experience with the book, and then in my wrap-ups I can just refer to the book talk and give a summary, hopefully, of this, because my wrap-ups are otherwise way too long. So for today, the first book talk, officially called book talk, that I will be doing, I will be discussing War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy. Now this is a giant chunk of book, and holding it up is going to be a chore in itself, but so I have this beautiful edition. It's a vintage classic. They have it for multiple Russian literary books. It's got these beautiful end pages. It is 1,270, I think, about pages, but the like final 55 or something is like the glossary or appendices. So basically the book itself is 1,250 pages in this edition. I really loved it, but I will admit that I didn't read it physically. I listened to it on audiobook, and at the same time I was kind of like moving my bookmark from like chapter to chapter, just because it's super strenuous to read. It's also very clumsy because of the size, and so I would move my bookmark along so that when like an interesting passage came along, I could just like look for it in the written text, and then mark that passage, because I do like to mark passages that I really enjoy, and that is something that I feel an audiobook is kind of lacking in being able to like easily mark those passages off of. Now, War and Peace, it's one of the greatest books of all times. It's one of the biggest chunks of literary heritage. It's a classic for a reason. It's the biggest classic of Russian literature. It was published in the 19th century and written by Leo Tolstoy. Now the scope of this book is very big, so my description of the book is going to be super short in that sense, because it's just impossible to really go into like what happens in the book or anything like that. But basically you're following a set of individuals, mostly people of the aristocracy in Russia, during the Napoleonic Wars. So it's a very troublesome time. We are moving in and out of wars, and we are following people both at the front and back home in like St. Petersburg or Moscow. So we have a mix of characters, because some of them of course will be going off to the war, so we will be following them while they are at war, and also at times when they are back at home with their family or before the wars take place. And then we have other characters like the females in this story, for example, who have to sit at home, wait for news to reach them from the front, wait to see whether their lovers, their love interests, their brothers, their family members, whether they will all survive. I think it was a very interesting book, and I was really not expecting it to be that interesting, because I had not necessarily bad experiences with Russian literature, but I had like the impression with all of my reading of Russian literature that it is a struggle. You need to focus on it. It is difficult, and I did not have this with this. I will say that I did in the beginning definitely have to put some more effort into it, just to figure out like, okay, who are our main characters, and to kind of remember their names. And I don't know whether it's the fact that this is like my fourth Russian novel, or whether it's something else, but I found myself having less difficulty remembering the names of these characters as I have had in the past with other characters. I also feel like in this one it happened less, or this is again me being more used to it, but it happened less that the characters being named by like 5 different names. And like the first time I read a Russian novel, I think like it took me like 200 pages to suddenly be like, wait, that name and that name, that's the same character. So I never had this for this book, and like sometimes a character is only named by his last name, and then you're in trouble if you haven't tried to remember his last name. So you shouldn't just remember, like for example, you should just remember Prince Vasily. You need to kind of remember his last name as well, so that when he's referred to by his last name, you know who we're talking about. And that usually seems like it is either just because we're less familiar with these types of Russian names, or because it's less like it's taken for granted in Russian culture. But it seems like in a modern book, like you would put more of a clue in there when you first introduce a character only by his last name. You would put more of a clue in there, like this is Vasily we're talking about. And that is definitely not happening in Russian literature, so you might get lost at times with that. That being said, I also felt like with this reading experience, I had more of a understanding that you don't have to remember all of the names. There are like 5 to 6 very central characters, then there's like the closer circle around them, and then you have a lot of side characters. And ideally you remember these names because they do pop up from time to time, and then the ones that when you know one of these names, there was like Dolohov, for example, is a name that I knew and remembered, and so I knew who we were talking about, and that gives like a certain atmosphere to the book because you kind of remember previous scenes from him. But if you didn't remember those previous scenes, they didn't necessarily take too much away from the story later on. It's just that you have an added dimension when you remember the first things. So I really did learn also that to not bother too much about certain names, or to not be upset with myself or later on in the novel if a certain character was like, who is that? I would just be like, whatever, it'll be clear in a couple of pages who this person is, what his profession is, or anything that I need to understand the scene in which I'm reading this character will be clear in this scene. And so I think this is definitely something you need to take away with a Russian novel. You definitely need to learn to invest the energy and attention, if you need it, so maybe you're natural with Russian names, in certain characters to remember, like, okay, who is this, what is this relationship to this or that person. But there are definitely always characters that you can definitely forget about, because they are more side characters. I very much liked the tone that this book took on, because, so as I said, I was going into it expecting it to be more difficult, expecting it to be more long-winded, and I'm definitely not saying it isn't that in parts. I mean, I guess it's definitely descriptions of battles and stuff like that can get pretty long-winded, but I really enjoyed the tone. And to me, and this might be due to the English translation, but to me it was very reminiscent of Austen. You know, at times we were definitely looking at stereotypical characters within the aristocracy. You know, the schemers trying to get influence in society, the mothers trying to get their sons in high places, the fathers trying to get their daughters married off the best as possible. And these things are all described with a very like light sense of humor, the way that Austen does. You know, she describes it and you sense that there is some cynicism behind it, that she's kind of mocking the people throughout her description, though she's never outwardly mocking them at all. But I really enjoy that tone, because I think it's like a very mild way to look at these situations and to draw attention to the reader to the fact that these things might actually be problematic. As I already kind of indicated, this is mostly a look at the aristocratic society at the time, so if you're looking for more of a nitty and gritty, down to earth as you might get in a Dickens novel, for example, you will not get it in War and Peace by Tolstoy. Tolstoy very much stays with the higher circles of society. You might get an occasional opinion from a member of a lower class, but that's really, really rare, so I wouldn't go into this expecting to get that. So in a way, to me, it was very reminiscent of Jane Austen, not just that tone, but also just the setting. You know, we are pushed into this high society, we have to maneuver it along with our main characters and try to get the best situation in life possible, but this is then being interlaced with the story of the war and the way and a commentary that Tolstoy is making about the way in which history is being written. So he very much tries to put a focus on the fact that history is always looking at the key players, and it's presenting historic events through the eyes of it's presenting these historic events as if they are the result of these key players' will. These key players make up their mind and they make a decision, and this decides the course of history. But what Tolstoy is trying to say is that these key players are not the decision makers. They are the ones who are kind of moving along with the stream of the mass. It's the mass which is actually making these changes, and the key players are just like the representatives of this mass, or representatives opposing the mass, or anything like that. So what he's trying to, what he's kind of requesting is for history to take a look at the bigger picture, for history to be able to look at the big influence of the time, you know, the way that the mass is steering the times. What he's kind of saying, for example, is also like, when we look at the Napoleonic Wars from our standpoint, and basically what we're looking at is from a standpoint from the 19th century, mid-19th century, we have hindsight. So it's easy with hindsight to sort of consider all of these actions as if they were part of this like big master plan, but he's saying, in reality, this wasn't the case at all. Like, wars start because of reactions to certain things, and they are often not planned in advance. They're often really just a reaction to an event taking place, or the movement of a certain spirit in a nation, that the nation feels like it needs to defend itself, or things like that. And the way in which the wars develop are also always being presented as like, yeah, he decided to go there because this was a strategic place to go. Whereas Tolstoy is kind of indicating, like, usually the most of the decisions being taken in wars are decisions that are being taken in the moment. You know, the decisions that really make an impact on the war are the second-to-second decisions that soldiers need to make out on the field, and while doing so they most likely will just actually be disobeying the general orders that they might have had in advance. It's often also showing it throughout the book, like scenes in which one general has set up a certain plan in which there's like a surprise attack, but then another person, like an officer, might stumble upon this secret contingent and be like, why are these men standing here? What did they do? Come on guys, move over to that army. And then the general's plan is like completely ruined because nobody else seems to know about it. And this is basically what he's showing throughout, how there isn't such a thing as a strategy in war. It's just people reacting to things, a lot of miscommunication, a lot of misunderstandings, like the high powers giving their orders about things, but those orders never reaching down to like the soldiers themselves in the fields. And so that way he's really trying to show like that history is wrong in saying that in the way that they are representing these elements. And this is a theme that is coming back throughout the book. So throughout the book he will refer to it, and that is probably one of the major problems you might have while reading this. So there is a lot of long-winded descriptions of stuff, but I think that is just, that didn't feel like boring to me neither. It just felt like, yeah, there's definitely stuff in there that you could scrap, that an abridged version of this could definitely leave out a lot of stuff. But what is also there, which I think is masterful in a way, but I think will be annoying in another way as well, is that there's a lot of repetition. So this idea about history and the way history is being represented is definitely introduced and discussed multiple times throughout the book. And every single time he will bring up the same arguments, but he will just show them in the light of the new situation in which the war is at that point in the book. And so you're really getting repetitions. At a certain point it's really becoming deja vu, which in a sense is masterful, because in a way war will probably feel like a certain deja vu in a sense as well, because when you get down to the nitty and gritty of it, it's just you as a soldier trying to survive, opposing another soldier, and just trying to be the one who's left standing. So oftentimes he will be referring to the same things, he will introduce them in the same way, so that it really is a strong sense of, I've read this before. Like, wait, did I just go back a few chapters? Because I already heard this, right? In my sense, because I was listening to it. But that was his way of kind of picking up where he left off and adding something to the discussion about it again and again and again. I do feel like this can be annoying to people. I definitely felt like it was disconcerting at times to be like, oh right, okay, it is the same thing, but we are like going into it. I think it would have been fine if it hadn't been for the second epilogue. So this book does something that I hate. It has epilogues. I hate epilogues. I think a book ends and there's no need to put an extra ending to it. Especially not if your epilogue is going to be like an enumeration of what happened to each and every single character in the book, usually way too fast, so that it's really just felt as I feel like it really just comes across as if you're like checking a book. Like there's almost no feeling about it anymore, no thoughts, it seems like there's not much effort put into the way this is presented to the reader neither. So I always feel like it's not necessarily, it's way too fast, it's like a total break of tone from the rest of the novel usually. And I'm not saying that there are no good epilogues, there are good epilogues. The good epilogues for me personally are the ones who then like basically add new mystery or the promise of like a different direction to the book. So there's like the ones who might have ended on a good note and then like put in a little twist in sort of an epilogue, which kind of makes it open again. So I know it's totally personal preference because I just hate my books being closed, so that's why I also hate all of the epilogues and the trend towards epilogues recently. This book has 2 epilogues. First one I would say is not an epilogue, it's actually just part of the book and they should have just called it volume 6 or something like that, or included it in volume 5. And in that first epilogue we are following certain characters that we have been following throughout, and we are seeing their situation after the ending. Basically it's not in epilogue style, as in it's not like cookie cutter, it's not super sweet or whatever, and like, oh, everything's happy or whatever. No, it's really like scenes from their day-to-day reality at certain points, and it mixes good and bad in their relationship. And so in that sense I liked that first epilogue, but I don't think it's an epilogue. Epilogue number 2 might be considered an epilogue, and it's not necessarily the kind that I usually hate, it's a different kind. So epilogue 2 really is a development of his theory about the way that history should be written. And yeah, that really takes up a lot, and it's just, you know, the book is over. You've introduced these theories throughout the book, you've demonstrated that theory throughout the book, and there's really no need to expound upon it even more. Definitely not in a 40-page dissertation, as it feels like, about history and the way that history should be written. So for me this was really like, it was really the low point of the book, and I really had to keep myself from downgrading the rating for this book, because the ending of a book to me is very important to the feel of the book. I'm very much an ending person versus the beginning person, and so if a book ends well, I will forgive it for a lot throughout the book. If a book doesn't end well, that's the problem. So I really had to keep myself from subtracting from it. I really had to be like, come on, I liked 1,170 pages of this book, don't take away from this book just because of the last 40 pages, which is like less than 1% of the entire book. So for me this really was boring, it felt redundant, it was another repetition of a repetition of a repetition, and I felt like this really wasn't needed. But I think this is also somewhat to do with the time. I think we've evolved to a literature in which we don't do that anymore, but I think at the time we probably did indeed, there was this need to kind of show the reader what we were doing, not just have there was a kind of need to explain to the reader what we were doing, not just show the reader. So we've shown the reader throughout, but we still need to explain to the reader just in case he hasn't caught up yet. And so for me as a modern reader that really is not necessary, but that being said, the insights that are being gained were very interesting, but it's just that they were already gained throughout. I really highly recommend this book. I think it's very interesting for anybody who likes who likes Jane Austen. If you need some more, go for War and Peace. Give it a go. I'm not promising you will love it because everybody's reader tastes are different, of course. It reminded me a lot of her voice, but it might be that you like things in Austen's that are different than the things that this book reminded me of about her books. I definitely think it's very interesting in case you are interested in war and history, in the way that history is being written down, in the way that we remember things that happened in the past. I think it is an interesting look also at the way people experience war. There are very different experiences with war here, and there's definitely also this sort of like startlement for the first time in war of like, I didn't know that this is the reality, and I'm not behaving as the hero as I thought I was gonna be. You have different, so you have different characters to follow. You have the hero characters, you have the more like side characters who are heroes to us because we want to see them succeed, but who might not have that prominent role in the end. Then you have like the love histories developing, so very much this is like love triangles avant la lettre. So I'm not saying that it's the same sort of like angsty love triangles as you see in YA nowadays, but it definitely has its love triangles, maybe even love, what would you call that, rectangles, yeah. And I feel they're very different here, as in it's more like the persons are being steered in one direction or another, more based on the circumstances or the way that their characters have developed throughout the experiences they've had, versus like a sort of, oh no, I love him but I also love him type of love triangle that you have in YA. This is very much more of a, at certain times in their lives they're drawn to this type of person, but then through circumstances they learn to appreciate another type of person, for example. So I think there's a lot to be gained from this. I've definitely highlighted a lot of beautiful passages, and I will definitely be putting this down as a candidate for one of my favorite classics of all times, which is a video that I want to hopefully get done at some point when I'm feeling like, when I'm feeling down to it, I guess. I feel like the problem I have is I've read quite a lot of them, but it's all been so long ago that I now no longer feel competent to talk about them, which I guess in a way is stupid because, I mean, I cannot talk too in depth about them anymore, that's true, but I can still go off of the feeling that I had with them at that time. And then if I reread them, and I'm of course free to change my mind about them. But so War and Peace, a definite win for me. I will be watching the movie with Audrey Hepburn, I will be watching the series with Lily James, and I'll be coming back with you guys with a new video in which I'm comparing the book to those two. So yeah, I hope you like this video. Please like and subscribe if you do. Let me know whether you like the type of book talk format. I feel like it's a little bit more of a casual book review, or at least to me it feels more like that, less like I need to make sure that I've covered every single aspect of the book in this talk. I have no fixed filming schedule, so I film whenever and I post whenever. Deal with it. But yeah, see you guys.